I pressed the doorbell and waited, holding my daughter's hand while the cold evening air settled around us like something heavy and unwanted. Inside my mother's house, I could hear movement. Footsteps crossed the hardwood floor. Soft laughter drifted through the walls. And somewhere in the background, music played, bright. Cheerful birthday music that didn't belong to us anymore. The porch light glowed above our heads, casting a pale circle around Emily and me, making us feel like we were standing on display. I pressed the bell again. Emily's fingers tightened around mine. Her hand was small but tense, her skin cold despite the sweater she wore. I squeezed gently, trying to reassure her, even though my own chest felt tight. "It's okay," I whispered. "Grandma's probably busy." More footsteps sounded from inside. I heard voices, familiar ones, but still, no one opened the door. So I pressed the bell a third time. Silence followed. Then my mother's voice came through the door, sharp and flat, without warmth. "She shouldn't be here." For a moment, I thought I had heard wrong. The words didn't make sense. They didn't belong in the middle of a birthday party, especially not one meant for family. Emily tilted her head up toward me, confusion spreading across her face. "Mom," she whispered. Before I could answer, I saw movement behind the frosted glass beside the door. Shadows shifted. My mother's outline became clearer, stiff and unmoving. And then I saw someone else behind her. My sister Megan, standing just a step behind our mother, arms folded across her chest. My mother spoke again, louder this time. "We decided she shouldn't come." Megan nodded slowly, like this had been discussed long before we ever arrived. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a decision. I stood frozen on the porch, trying to understand what was happening while the sound of laughter drifted from inside. Balloons bobbed gently behind the curtains, and through a small gap near the edge of the window, I could see part of the living room decorated with streamers and bright paper banners. It was my mother Eleanor's 71st birthday, a full family gathering, the kind of event she spent weeks planning. Cars lined the street in front of the house, proof that everyone else had arrived without trouble. Cousins, aunts, neighbors, people who had been welcomed through that same front door just minutes before. Emily stood beside me in the simple blue dress she had picked out herself earlier that afternoon. She had changed outfits twice before settling on this one, smoothing the fabric nervously each time she caught her reflection in the mirror. In her free hand, she still held the birthday card she had made the night before, construction paper folded neatly in half, carefully colored flowers along the front. Inside, she had written, in careful handwriting, "Happy birthday. Grandma, I hope your day is special." She had practiced saying those words in the car on the way over and over again. Now she didn't say anything at all. "Mom?" I said through the door, forcing my voice to stay steady. "What are you talking about?" My mother's silhouette shifted slightly, but she didn't open the door. "She makes people uncomfortable," she replied. The words hit me harder than I expected. "Uncomfortable," I repeated. "She just stands there." My mother continued, "She doesn't talk. She doesn't interact. I don't want that energy tonight." I felt heat rising behind my eyes, but I refused to let it turn into tears. "She's 13, I said quietly. "She's just shy." From behind my mother, Megan's voice joined in, calm and controlled. "We talked about this already," she said. "You know how these gatherings are. She doesn't fit in." Emily lowered her head beside me. She didn't protest, didn't cry, didn't even move. She just stared down at the birthday card in her hands as if it suddenly weighed too much to hold. Inside the house, someone laughed loudly, sharp and joyful, completely unaware of what was happening just outside the door. For a long moment, I stood there, waiting for someone to change their mind, waiting for the door handle to turn, waiting for the sound of a lock clicking open. But nothing happened. The door remained closed, cold, final. I swallowed the anger building in my chest and tightened my grip on Emily's hand. Without another word, I turned away from the door. We stepped down from the porch together, the sound of our shoes against the wooden steps echoing louder than it should have. The night air felt colder now, sharper against my skin. Behind us, the music inside continued. Laughter rose and fell like waves. Life carried on inside that house. Without us, Emily looked back once over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. Not angry, not crying, just confused. And somehow, that hurt more than anything else. We reached the car in silence. I unlocked the doors, and she climbed into the passenger seat without saying a word. The birthday card stayed clutched tightly in her hand. I started the engine, my fingers trembling slightly as I pulled away from the curb. Streetlights passed one by one, casting shifting shadows across the windshield. The road ahead blurred slightly as I focused on keeping my breathing steady. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The silence inside the car felt heavier than anything I had ever carried before. Then, finally, Emily's voice broke through it. Soft. "Careful. Mom, did I do something wrong?" The question landed deep inside my chest, sharp and painful. I tightened my hands on the steering wheel. "No," I said quickly. "You didn't do anything wrong." But even as I said the words, something unsettled stirred inside me. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. There had been other moments, other small exclusions, other quiet disappointments I had brushed aside over the years, telling myself they didn't mean anything. Now, as I drove us home through the quiet streets, those memories began to line up in my mind, one after another, forming a pattern I could no longer ignore. And for the first time, I started to wonder if tonight hadn't been about shyness at all, if it had been something much bigger, something planned, something deliberate. And as Emily sat beside me in silence, still holding that unopened birthday card in her lap, a single thought repeated itself over and over in my mind. This wasn't an accident. This was a choice. The next morning, the house felt too quiet, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the coffee maker while it hummed softly on the counter. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room, but I didn't feel comforted by it the way I usually did. Instead, there was a heavy stillness pressing down on everything. I hadn't slept much. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my mother's voice again. "She shouldn't be here." Those words replayed over and over in my head like a broken recording. I poured coffee into my mug but didn't drink it. My hand hovered over the counter as my eyes drifted toward the far edge of the kitchen. That was when I noticed it. Emily's birthday card, still sitting exactly where she had placed it the night before. Unopened, unseen. The paper was slightly bent now, the edges curling inward from where she had gripped it too tightly. A small crease ran through the center, right across the flowers she had colored so carefully. I walked closer and picked it up. My fingers traced over the uneven petals she had drawn with colored markers. Each flower was different, each one filled in with slow, patient strokes. She had spent almost an hour making this card, hunched over the dining table, tongue pressed against the corner of her mouth in concentration. She had wanted it to be perfect, and no one inside that house had even looked at it. Footsteps sounded softly behind me. I turned to see Emily standing in the doorway. She looked smaller than usual in the oversized sweatshirt she wore, her hair still tangled from sleep. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor, avoiding mine. "Morning," I said gently. She nodded but didn't answer. Instead, she walked slowly into the kitchen and climbed onto one of the chairs at the table. Her movements were careful, quiet, like she didn't want to disturb the air. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she asked, without looking up, "Can I stay home from school today?" Her voice was soft, flat, almost tired. That request hit me harder than tears ever could have. Emily never asked to stay home, not even when she was sick. She liked routines, structure, quiet spaces where she understood what to expect. The fact that she didn't want to go told me more than anything else could have. I hesitated for a second before answering. "Just today," I said. "We'll take a day." She nodded again. Still quiet. Still distant. Then, Without warning, she reached for the birthday card I had placed back on the counter. For a moment, she just held it in both hands, staring at the front as if she were reading the flowers again. And then, slowly, she stood up, walked to the trash can, and dropped the card inside. No hesitation, no dramatic movement, just a quiet decision. The soft sound of paper hitting the bottom of the bin echoed louder than it should have. I felt something inside my chest twist painfully. Emily, I started, but the words didn't come. She didn't look at me, didn't explain. She just returned to her chair and sat down again, hands folded tightly in her lap. That silence pressed against me until memories began rising without permission. The first one came quickly. Thanksgiving last year. I saw the long dining table again, covered in heavy plates and steaming bowls of food. Laughter had filled the room, voices overlapping as everyone talked at once. But Emily hadn't been sitting with us. She had been placed at the small folding table near the kitchen doorway. Kids are more comfortable together, my mother had said casually, waving her hand as if it didn't matter. Except there hadn't been other kids at that table. Just Emily. She had eaten quietly, her fork moving slowly while the rest of the family talked and laughed without noticing. At the time, I told myself it wasn't intentional, that it was just logistics. Now, that memory didn't feel harmless anymore. Another memory followed. Christmas morning. The living room had been filled with gifts stacked high beneath the tree. Bright wrapping paper, ribbons, laughter, excitement. Each child opened something different. A bike, a tablet, new art supplies. When it was Emily's turn, my mother handed her a small envelope. Inside was a gift card. Generic, no personal touch, no thought behind it. Emily had smiled politely, thanking her grandmother, pretending she was just as excited as everyone else. But later that night, I found the gift card still sitting on her desk, untouched. And now, sitting in the kitchen, watching her stare blankly at the tabletop. That memory felt heavier than it ever had before. The third memory came last. Her school recital. I remembered sitting alone in the auditorium, clutching my phone while scanning the rows of seats behind me. My mother had promised she would come. So had Megan. I had saved a seat between us, left it empty, reserved. Emily had stepped onto the stage that night and searched the audience, her eyes moving from face to face until they landed on mine. Just mine. Afterward, she had walked beside me through the school hallway and asked quietly, "Did Grandma get lost?" At the time, I told her something about traffic. Something simple. Something comforting. Now, that memory felt like a lie I had told myself. Back in the kitchen, I stared down at my untouched coffee, now cooling beside my hand. 3 memories. 3 separate moments. Different years. Different situations. But the same result. Emily had always been set slightly apart. Always given a reason. Always told she was just shy. My chest tightened as another memory pushed forward, this one more recent. An email. 6 months ago. From Megan. At the time, I barely paid attention to it. Something about family planning. Something about recognition. I had skimmed it quickly and moved on. Now, the words returned to me with unsettling clarity. Confidence matters in this family. I stood suddenly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. Emily looked up briefly at the sound, her eyes filled with quiet uncertainty. "I'll be right back," I said gently. She nodded but didn't ask questions. I walked into the living room and opened my laptop, my fingers moving faster than my thoughts. The screen lit up, casting pale light across the room. I opened my email inbox, typed Megan's name into the search bar. Hundreds of messages appeared, scrolling, until one subject line caught my eye, the same one I remembered. Family Youth Recognition Committee. My stomach tightened. I clicked on it. The email opened slowly, the text filling the screen. Formal wording. Structured language. Discussion about leadership. Confidence. Eligibility. And near the bottom One line stood out more than anything else. Bold. Underlined. Impossible to ignore. Only confident children should be nominated. I stared at that sentence, my heartbeat pounding loudly in my ears. And for the first time, I felt the shift happening inside me. Not confusion. Not sadness. Something sharper. Something colder. Because deep down, I had the sinking feeling that Emily hadn't just been overlooked. She had been deliberately left out. I kept staring at the screen long after the words stopped making sense. The light from the laptop cast a pale glow across the living room, making everything feel colder than it should have. My coffee sat forgotten beside me, untouched. The surface now completely still. My finger hovered over the trackpad as I scrolled further down the email thread. More messages appeared. Replies. Attachments. Names I recognized, family members. Cousins. And most often, Megan. This wasn't a single email. It was a conversation that had been happening for months. Quietly. Without me. I clicked on the first attachment. A document opened slowly. The title appearing at the top of the page. Family Youth Recognition Scholarship. My chest tightened. I leaned closer, reading each line carefully. The scholarship had been created years ago by my grandfather, Thomas Bennett. I remembered him clearly, his deep voice, his careful way of speaking, the way he always made time to listen when children spoke, no matter how small their voices were. According to the document, the scholarship was awarded once every year. One grandchild, chosen based on leadership, confidence, and community presence. A lump formed in my throat. I had grown up hearing about that fund. It had always been described as something generous, something meant to help the next generation succeed. But I had never paid attention to the details. Never thought about who decided. Never asked how nominations worked. Until now. I scrolled further. Another file appeared. Scholarship recipient history. I clicked it. A list opened, showing years arranged in neat rows. Beside each year, a name. I began reading slowly. 2018. Megan's son, Tyler. 2019. Our cousin Rebecca's daughter. 2020. Another nephew. Name after name. Each one familiar. Each one someone I had seen praised at family gatherings. Encouraged. Celebrated. My heartbeat grew louder in my ears. I kept scanning the list, my eyes moving quickly now, searching for something specific. Searching for Emily. But her name never appeared. Not once. Not in any year. Not even listed as nominated. It was as if she had never existed. My hand tightened around the edge of the laptop. A memory surfaced without warning. Grandfather's voice. Clear. Warm. Years ago, during a summer gathering in his backyard, he had stood near the picnic table, addressing the family. I remembered the sunlight filtering through the trees, the smell of grilled food drifting through the air. He had lifted his glass slightly and smiled at all of us. This fund, he had said, his voice steady and proud, is meant to support every child in this family. Every child. Not the loud ones. Not the confident ones. Every child. Back in the present. I leaned back in my chair, my chest tight. That memory now felt heavier than before, like something important had been twisted into something unrecognizable. I returned to the email thread and noticed something else. The sender names repeated again and again. Megan. 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 Her name appeared more than anyone else's. Not just replying. Leading. Organizing. Guiding. I scrolled up to the top of one message and noticed a title beneath her name. Committee Coordinator. My breath caught in my throat. Megan wasn't just involved. She was in charge. The realization hit me like cold water. All those times she had spoken confidently about family events, all those moments she had insisted things were handled fairly, she had been shaping decisions from behind the scenes. I scrolled further down until another attachment appeared. Evaluation report. Emily Bennett, age 13. My finger hesitated for a second before clicking it. The document opened. Her name appeared at the top. Seeing it written there sent a sharp wave of tension through my body. Below it were sections filled with notes. Personality observations. Participation assessment. Communication readiness. Each line felt colder than the last. Quiet. Reserved. Limited social engagement. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep reading. Then my eyes landed on a sentence that made my chest tighten. Not socially suitable for public representation. I stared at those words until they blurred. Not suitable. Not capable. Not worthy. They had judged her, written her off, placed a label on her without ever asking me, without ever giving her a chance. A heavy silence filled the room. I closed the laptop halfway and leaned back, pressing my fingers against my forehead. This wasn't just about a birthday party anymore. This wasn't about one closed door. This was something bigger. Something built over time. Carefully. Quietly. Systematically. Another memory surfaced suddenly. Emily standing in the hallway months ago, holding a small flyer she had brought home from school. There had been a family youth presentation event scheduled during one of our gatherings. She had asked me if she could participate. At the time, I had brushed it off, told her we'd think about it. Later, she mentioned she hadn't been invited. I hadn't questioned it. Now, that moment felt important, like a clue I had ignored. Footsteps sounded softly behind me. I turned to see Emily standing near the doorway again. She held a notebook against her chest, her fingers gripping the edges tightly. "Mom," she asked quietly. Her voice pulled me fully back into the present. "Yes," I replied. She hesitated before speaking again. "Do you think Grandma is mad at me?" The question landed heavily in the air between us. I forced myself to soften my expression, even though anger burned quietly inside my chest. "No," I said carefully. "She's not mad at you." Emily nodded slowly, though she didn't look convinced. She walked over to the couch and sat down, opening her notebook across her knees. Her pencil moved carefully across the page. Writing? Not drawing. Writing. Curious? I leaned slightly to the side and caught a glimpse of the words forming beneath her hand. Short sentences. Thoughtful ones. Carefully arranged. They weren't childish thoughts. They were reflections. Feelings written in a way that felt older than her years. I noticed one sentence clearly before she turned the page. "Being quiet doesn't mean I don't have anything to say." The words struck me harder than anything else I had read that morning. Maybe she wasn't invisible. Maybe she had been waiting for someone to notice. I turned back toward the laptop and reopened the evaluation document. Scrolling slowly, carefully, that was when I noticed something I had almost missed. Near the bottom of the page, a handwritten comment scanned into the document. Small, easy to overlook, but impossible to ignore once seen. "She lacks the presence our family expects." I sat there in silence, staring at those words until my breathing slowed into something steady and controlled. They hadn't just excluded her. They had defined her, limited her, decided what she could be before she ever had the chance to prove herself. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. I stopped wondering whether this was unfair. I stopped hoping it was a misunderstanding. Instead, a new question formed in my mind. Who decided my daughter didn't belong? Because the next thing I planned to do was find out exactly how far this had gone. That evening, I found myself watching Emily in a way I never had before. She sat cross-legged on the living room floor, her notebook balanced carefully against her knees. The lamp beside the couch cast a soft circle of light around her, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. Outside, the sky had already darkened, and the quiet of the house pressed in around us. Her pencil moved slowly, carefully, like each word required thought before it touched the page. I leaned back against the couch, pretending to read something on my phone, but my eyes kept drifting toward her. She wasn't doodling. She wasn't scribbling random shapes the way younger children did. She was writing, pausing, erasing, rewriting, thinking. That realization stirred something uneasy inside me. For years, I had worried about how quiet she was, how she avoided attention. How she blended into corners of rooms during family gatherings, while louder voices filled the space around her. But now, watching her closely, I began to wonder if quiet didn't mean empty. If quiet meant something else entirely. Emily stood suddenly and walked toward the kitchen, leaving her notebook open on the floor beside the couch. I hesitated. A part of me told me not to look, that it was her private space. But curiosity pulled stronger than hesitation. Slowly, I leaned forward. Just one glance. That was all I told myself. The page was filled with lines of writing. Not drawings. Sentences arranged in neat paragraphs. Carefully spaced. Thoughtfully written. My chest tightened as I read the first few lines. It felt like no one noticed when I was in the room. Sometimes I wondered if being quiet made people forget I existed. I swallowed hard. Those weren't childish thoughts. They were honest ones. The kind of thoughts most adults kept hidden. I kept reading. Being quiet doesn't mean I don't have anything to say. That sentence stopped me completely. It sat alone on the page, written slightly darker than the rest, as if she had pressed harder with the pencil. Like it mattered more. A memory surfaced suddenly, pulling me backward in time. I was 17 again, standing behind a podium in my high school gymnasium. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the floor, filled with students, teachers, and parents. The air smelled faintly of floor polish and nervous sweat. My hands had trembled so badly that I thought the paper in front of me might slip from my grip. "You're not born confident," my debate coach had whispered just before I stepped forward. "You practice confidence until it feels real." I remembered swallowing hard, forcing myself to speak even when my voice shook. I remembered the fear, the doubt, the tightness in my chest. And I remembered the moment when my voice stopped trembling. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because I had practiced enough to keep going anyway. Back in the present, I stared down at Emily's notebook again. She wasn't incapable. She wasn't weak. She had words, thoughts, feelings. She just didn't have a stage. That realization settled into place slowly, like a puzzle piece clicking where it belonged. What if the problem wasn't her personality? What if the problem was opportunity? I leaned back again just as Emily returned from the kitchen, carrying a glass of water. She sat down and pulled the notebook toward herself, unaware that I had read even a single word. I watched her quietly, studying her, thinking. And then, without warning, a memory surfaced, small, almost forgotten. A flyer pinned to the corkboard at the community center. Bright paper. Bold letters. Youth Storytelling Showcase. I had walked past it weeks earlier without giving it much thought. At the time, it had just been another event in a long list of community activities. Now, it felt different. Important. Possibility flickered inside my chest. I stood slowly and walked into the kitchen, pulling my phone from my pocket. My fingers moved quickly across the screen. Searching. Typing. Youth Storytelling Showcase Spokane? The page loaded. Details appeared. Local middle school students. Public performance. Community judges. My eyes scanned downward. Date. Time. Registration deadline? 10 days away. My breath caught. 10 days? Not months. Not weeks. 10 days. My heart began beating faster. Not from fear, but from something sharper, hope mixed with urgency. Registration was still open. Barely. Almost closed. But still possible. I stared at the screen for several long seconds before walking back into the living room. Emily looked up when she heard my footsteps. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. I sat down beside her, careful not to startle her. "I was thinking," I said slowly, choosing my words with care. "Have you ever thought about sharing your writing out loud?" Her body stiffened instantly. The change was immediate, visible. Her shoulders tightened. Her fingers pressed harder against the notebook. "No," she said quickly. Short. Firm. Fear filled that single word. "They'd laugh," she added quietly. The honesty in her voice cut straight through me. I shifted slightly closer to her, Can I tell you something? I asked. She hesitated, then nodded once. I used to be scared to speak in front of people, too, I said gently. Her head tilted slightly, curiosity replacing fear for just a moment. You? She asked. I nodded. I used to shake so badly I thought I'd drop my papers, I admitted. I wanted to run off stage every single time. Her eyes narrowed slightly, studying my face. Not quite believing. I stood up and walked to the hallway closet, digging through a box tucked high on the shelf. After a few seconds, I found what I was looking for. An old photograph, faded at the edges. I carried it back and handed it to her. She stared down at it, her eyes widening slightly. It showed me standing behind a podium, holding a microphone, a banner hanging behind me that read, "Debate Finals." You really did that? She asked. I did, I said softly. Not because I wasn't scared. Because I practiced until I could do it anyway. She stared at the photo for a long moment before handing it back to me. Silence filled the room again. Then, slowly, I opened my laptop and turned the screen toward her. What if, I said carefully, you tried something like this? She leaned forward slightly, reading the page. Youth Storytelling Showcase. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the laptop. This isn't about being loud, I added gently. It's about being heard. She read every word on the screen in silence. Time stretched. Heavy. Uncertain. What if I forget everything? She whispered. The fear in her voice was familiar. I remembered feeling that exact same fear years ago. We practice? I said simply. She looked back at her notebook, then at the screen, then at me. Several long seconds passed. Finally, she nodded. Small, barely noticeable, but it changed everything. Without speaking another word, I turned the laptop back toward me and filled in the registration form. Name? Emily Bennett. Age 13. My fingers paused only once before pressing submit. A confirmation message appeared instantly. Registration complete. A quiet sound chimed from the computer. Soft, but powerful. Emily returned to her notebook, flipping to a fresh page. Her pencil moved again, slower this time, more deliberate. As I watched her write, a strange feeling settled inside me. Not fear, not doubt, something stronger. Because deep down, I knew one thing for certain. If my family found out about this, they wouldn't approve. And as Emily continued writing quietly beneath the soft glow of the lamp, I realized this decision wasn't just about helping her speak. It was about proving they were wrong. Because 10 days from now, Emily wouldn't be invisible anymore. Emily stood in the middle of the living room, clutching her printed pages with both hands as if they might slip away if she loosened her grip. Okay, I said gently from the couch. Start from the top. She nodded once, her shoulders tense, her eyes fixed on the paper instead of me. Her voice came out soft at first, barely louder than a whisper. Sometimes being quiet makes people think you don't exist. She paused halfway through the next sentence, swallowing hard. Keep going. I encouraged. Slow down. Take your time. She inhaled deeply, her chest rising and falling in uneven motions. The paper trembled slightly between her fingers, but she didn't stop. This was the third day of practice, and each time she stood there, the fear showed itself in different ways. Tight shoulders, shaky hands, shallow breaths. But she never walked away. She never quit. That mattered more than anything. Look up when you finish a sentence, I reminded her softly. She tried. Her eyes flicked upward for half a second before dropping again to the page. Still, it was progress. By the time she reached the bottom of the page, her voice cracked once. But she finished the paragraph without stopping. When she lowered the paper, a faint smile appeared on her lips. Small, barely noticeable. But it was the first time I had seen that expression since the night of the party. You did it, I said. She let out a shaky breath. I didn't mess up too much, she whispered. Not at all, I replied. For a moment, hope settled gently into the room. Then the doorbell rang. The sudden sound cut through the silence. Sharp and unexpected. Emily flinched slightly. "I'll get it," I said, standing up. But when I reached the door and opened it, no one stood outside. Just the empty porch. Cold air drifted inside, brushing against my face. I stepped forward slightly, scanning the walkway. Nothing. No footsteps. No car pulling away. Just quiet. A strange feeling settled into my chest. Uneasy. I closed the door slowly and reached into my pocket when my phone vibrated. A message had appeared on the screen. From Megan. My stomach tightened immediately. "Why didn't you tell us about the showcase?" The words sat there, blunt and direct. My pulse quickened. How did she find out? I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. Not my mother. Not my sister. Not a single person in that family. Behind me, Emily shifted nervously. "Who was it?" she asked. "No one important," I said quickly, forcing calm into my voice. But before I could say anything else, the phone rang. Megan's name flashed across the screen. I stared at it for a moment before answering. "Hello," I said carefully. Her voice came through immediately. Calm but cold. "Why didn't you tell us about the showcase?" There was no greeting. No softness. Just accusation. "It's just a community event," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Nothing major." "That's not the point," she said sharply. "You're pushing her into something she can't handle." Her words tightened around my chest. "She can handle more than you think," I replied quietly. A brief silence followed. Then Megan spoke again, slower this time. "Mom agrees with me." That sentence landed like a stone dropping into deep water. "She thinks you're making a mistake." Not concern? Not support. Judgment. Final. Emily watched me from across the room, her eyes searching my face for clues. I forced a small smile toward her, pretending everything was fine. "I have to go," I told Megan, ending the call before she could say anything else. The moment the line went silent, another message arrived. From my mother. Short. Formal. "You should reconsider." No greeting. No affection. No warmth. Just instruction. I stared at the words longer than I meant to. Something about the tone felt rehearsed. Planned. Like this wasn't a reaction, it was part of a strategy. That thought unsettled me more than anything else. Later that evening, after Emily returned to practicing, I opened my laptop again. The house had grown quiet except for the soft sound of her voice repeating lines across the room. I searched back through the scholarship email thread, scrolling carefully through earlier messages. That was when I saw it. A date. Buried in one of the attachments. Committee review meeting. Scheduled. I leaned closer to the screen. Reading again. And again. The numbers didn't change. The meeting was scheduled exactly 10 days from now. The same day as the storytelling showcase. A chill ran down my spine. The timing wasn't coincidence. It was connected. If Emily spoke publicly, if people saw her, if she proved them wrong, that could change everything. My phone vibrated again. Unknown number. No name attached. Just digits I didn't recognize. I hesitated before opening the message. Then I read the words, "Some things are better left alone." Cold air seemed to fill the room. My hand tightened around the phone. Not spam. Not random. Someone knew what we were doing. Someone didn't want us to continue. Across the room, Emily kept reading her speech aloud, unaware of the message sitting in my hand, unaware of the pressure building behind the scenes. I glanced toward her, watching the way her voice trembled slightly as she repeated the same sentence again. She stopped suddenly and looked at me. "Are we still practicing?" she asked quietly. There was hesitation in her voice, as if she sensed something shifting in the air. "Yes." I answered immediately. Firm. Certain. Without hesitation. She nodded and returned to reading. This time, her voice sounded steadier, stronger. Not fearless, but determined. And that single change shifted something inside me. Fear didn't disappear, but it transformed into focus. Later that night, after Emily went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the phone screen again. The unknown message still glowed faintly against the darkness. I read it once more. Some things are better left alone. But the more I stared at those words, the more something inside me refused to step back. If someone wanted us to stop, that meant we were getting closer to something important. The phone buzzed again. Another notification. An email this time. Sender name appeared clearly at the top of the screen. Megan Bennett. My chest tightened as I read the subject line. Regarding Emily's eligibility, I didn't open it right away. Instead, I stared at the screen, feeling the weight of whatever waited inside that message. Because something had shifted. This wasn't just family disagreement anymore. This was becoming official. And as the email sat unopened in front of me, one thought settled heavily into my mind. They weren't just trying to stop Emily. They were trying to control the outcome. And whatever waited inside that message was going to show me exactly how far they were willing to go. I woke before the alarm, my eyes opening into a silence that felt heavier than any sound. For a few seconds, I lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to steady the rhythm of my breathing. The early morning light slipped through the edges of the curtains, gray and cold, barely warming the room. Today was the day. 10 days of practice, 10 days of doubt, encouragement, hesitation, and courage, all leading here. I swung my legs off the bed and walked quietly into the kitchen. The house felt too still, like even the walls were waiting to see what would happen next. I poured coffee into my mug, but didn't drink it. Instead, I stood at the counter, staring at the steam rising from the surface as if it might give me answers. My phone buzzed suddenly against the countertop. The sound made me flinch. I picked it up slowly. Unknown number. Again. The message was short. Still time to stop. My fingers tightened around the phone. The same cold tone. The same unsettling certainty. Someone knew what today meant. Across the hall, I heard movement. Soft footsteps. Emily appeared in the doorway, her hair still messy from sleep, her oversized sweatshirt slipping slightly off one shoulder. She looked smaller than usual, more fragile. "Are we really doing this today?" she asked quietly. Her voice carried hesitation, fear hiding beneath the surface. "Yes," I answered gently. "We are." She stepped into the kitchen and reached for the stack of papers resting on the table, her speech, printed neatly and folded at the corners from constant handling. She held the pages tightly against her chest. "What if I forget everything?" she whispered. The fear in her voice echoed the same fear I had heard every day since we started practicing. "You won't," I said calmly. "And even if you do, you'll find your way again." She nodded slightly, though uncertainty still lingered in her expression. We didn't talk much after that. The drive to the community hall passed in near silence. Gray clouds hung low over Spokane, pressing down against the rooftops as we moved through quiet streets. I kept both hands tight on the steering wheel while Emily sat beside me, staring out the window. Her lips moved silently, practicing, repeating lines under her breath. Every now and then, I caught fragments of her words, soft, careful phrases spoken just loud enough for her to hear herself. She didn't stop, even when traffic slowed, even when we turned into the parking lot. As I guided the car into an open space near the entrance, something caught my attention. A familiar vehicle. Parked 2 rows ahead, my breath caught. Megan's car. The recognition hit instantly. Cold. Unexpected. I stared at it for a moment longer than necessary before turning off the engine. Emily followed my gaze. "Is that Aunt Megan's car?" she asked. "Yes," I answered quietly. Her shoulders stiffened. Fear returned to her posture immediately. "She came," Emily whispered. "I guess so," I replied. We stepped out of the car together, the cold air biting against our skin. Ahead of us, the large community hall stood tall. Banners stretched across the entrance. Youth Storytelling Showcase. Families moved in and out of the building, children clutching papers, Parents offering last-minute encouragement. Energy filled the space, nervous excitement mixed with tension. Emily's hand slipped into mine without hesitation. Her grip tightened. "I don't like this," she murmured. "I know," I said softly. Inside, the noise grew louder, voices echoing across the hallway. Footsteps crossing polished floors. Chairs scraping against tile. And then I saw her. Megan, standing near the registration desk. Waiting. Watching. Her posture was stiff. Her expression unreadable. She didn't wave. Didn't smile. She simply stared. As if she had expected us. Emily slowed slightly beside me. Her fingers pressed tighter into my palm. Megan stepped forward. "I didn't think you'd actually bring her," she said calmly. Her tone carried judgment, not surprise. Emily lowered her eyes immediately, her shoulders curling inward. "She's prepared," I replied firmly. Megan tilted her head slightly, studying Emily with a measured gaze. "Mom is watching from home," she added quietly. "They're live streaming today." The words landed heavily. Emily heard them. I felt her hand tremble. Livestream. Not private. Not hidden. Public. Pressure pressed harder against my chest. But I forced myself to remain steady. "Good," I said simply. Megan said nothing more. She stepped aside, allowing us to move past her. But her eyes followed us all the way into the waiting area. Backstage, the air felt thick with nerves. Children whispered to themselves, practicing lines under their breath. Parents leaned close to their children, offering reassurance in hushed tones. Emily sat beside me on a narrow chair, clutching her speech. Her hands trembled. "I can't do this," she whispered suddenly. Her voice cracked. Tears gathered at the edges of her eyes. Fear had reached its peak. I leaned closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "You don't have to be loud," I said gently. "You just have to be honest." She swallowed hard, her breathing uneven. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know," I whispered. "So was I." A voice echoed through the hallway. Next speaker, Emily Bennett. The sound hit like thunder. Everything around us seemed to fade. Emily froze, her body locked in place. Time slowed. She looked at me, panic flashing across her face. For a moment, I thought she might run. But she didn't. I placed my hand over hers. Firm. Steady. "You can do this," I whispered. She stood slowly. Her legs looked unsteady. But they held one step, then another. She walked toward the stage entrance. The bright light spilled across the floor ahead of her. When she stepped into the spotlight, the room fell silent. Rows of faces stared back at her, waiting, watching. Her hands trembled as she reached the microphone stand. For a moment, she didn't speak, just breathed. Slow. Careful. Then she looked up, not at the crowd, at me, standing in the front row, waiting, believing. She inhaled deeply, her breath echoing through the microphone. And finally, her voice emerged. Soft, shaky, but clear. Sometimes being quiet makes people think you don't exist. The room remained silent, listening, focused. Her voice continued, trembling but steady enough to carry. As she spoke, I noticed movement near the back of the room. A woman holding a professional camera, recording. Not casually, carefully, deliberately. Emily reached the middle of her speech. Her voice grew stronger, more confident, more certain. A woman in the front row wiped tears from her eyes. Another leaned forward, listening more closely. Then, somewhere in the room, soft clapping began. One person, then another. Growing, spreading. Not full applause yet, but building. And as I stood there, watching my daughter speak words she once kept hidden inside her notebook, a realization settled deep inside me. This moment wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about proving her right. Because what happened next was going to change how everyone saw her forever. The applause didn't stop when Emily finished her last sentence. For a long moment, she stood frozen on the stage, her hands gripping the microphone stand as if letting go might cause everything to disappear. The silence that followed her final words had only lasted a second, but it felt endless. Then the clapping began. Slow at first. One pair of hands. Then another. Then more. Until the sound filled the entire room, echoing off the walls and rising higher than I ever expected. People began to stand, one by one. Rows of chairs scraping softly as adults and children rose to their feet. A standing ovation. For Emily. My throat tightened so suddenly that I couldn't breathe for a moment. My hands trembled at my sides as I watched her face shift from fear to disbelief. She looked stunned, unsure how to react, like she couldn't quite understand what was happening. Her eyes searched the crowd until they landed on me. I nodded slowly. Encouraging. Proud. She swallowed hard, her shoulders straightening just slightly as the applause continued. Somewhere near the front, a woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Another leaned toward the person beside her, whispering something while still clapping. Emily stepped away from the microphone carefully, her movements slow and cautious, like she didn't trust the floor beneath her feet. As she exited the stage, I rushed toward her. The moment she reached me, she stopped. "Did I mess up?" she asked quietly. Her voice was barely audible above the fading applause. "No," I whispered, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You did something incredible." She didn't answer, but her arms wrapped around me, holding tight, as if anchoring herself to the moment. Before I could say anything else, a woman approached us. She carried a professional camera, hanging from a strap around her neck. Her expression was warm but focused. "Excuse me?" she said politely. That was one of the most honest speeches I've heard in years. I turned toward her, still holding Emily close. "Thank you," I replied cautiously. "I volunteer with the local education media group," she continued. "We recorded her speech. With your permission, we'd like to share it on our community page." My heartbeat quickened. Share it? Publicly? The idea made my stomach twist, but not from fear, from possibility. I looked down at Emily. Her face was flushed, her eyes still wide from the experience. "What do you think?" I asked gently. She hesitated, then nodded. "Small. Careful." "Yes," she whispered. The woman smiled. "Wonderful," she said. "People need to hear voices like hers." Later that afternoon, after we returned home, the quiet inside the house didn't last long. My phone began buzzing almost immediately. One notification, then another, then several more. Messages appeared faster than I could read them. At first, I ignored them, too overwhelmed to respond. But eventually, curiosity pulled me in. I opened the first alert. Someone had tagged me in a post. A short video clip appeared on the screen. Emily standing on stage, speaking into the microphone. The caption read, "A powerful message from a brave young voice." My chest tightened as I watched the video replay. Her voice sounded stronger than I remembered. Clearer, more confident. Within minutes, new notifications appeared. Comments, shares, reactions. The numbers climbed steadily. More people were watching. More people were listening. And then my phone rang. Mother. Her name flashed across the screen. I stared at it for several seconds before answering. "Hello," I said quietly. Her voice sounded different. Not sharp. Not cold. Uncertain. "Why is everyone talking about Emily?" she asked. There was tension beneath her words. Not anger. Worry. "She spoke today," I replied calmly. "I've received 3 calls already," she continued. "Neighbors, friends, people asking about her." Her voice trembled slightly. "They saw the video." A strange silence followed. For the first time in years, I sensed hesitation from her. Not authority. Not control. Just discomfort. After the call ended, new messages continued flooding in. Friends from school. Parents from the community. People I barely knew. Many of them shared similar words. Your daughter is brave. That was beautiful. She has such strength. Emily sat beside me on the couch, watching quietly as I scrolled. What are they saying? She asked softly. Good things, I replied. She leaned closer, reading the messages herself. Her expression shifted from uncertainty to quiet surprise. They liked it, she asked. Yes, I answered. She stared at the screen longer than necessary, absorbing each comment slowly. Then one message appeared that made my breath catch. An email from an official address. Scholarship Committee. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The message was brief but formal. Due to recent developments and public attention, the committee requests a re-evaluation of Emily Bennett's eligibility. I stared at the words, reading them again to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. Re-evaluation. They were reconsidering. After all those years, before I could process it fully, my phone rang again. Megan. I hesitated, then answered. Her voice came quickly, sharp, restless. Who posted that video? She demanded. It was recorded at the event, I replied calmly. You should have told us, she snapped. Her tone carried something new. Not confidence. Not authority. Fear. We didn't expect this, she continued. People are talking. I listened without interrupting. For the first time, Megan sounded uncertain, unprepared, reactive. The balance had shifted. After the call ended, I sat quietly, staring at the email again. Emily leaned closer beside me. What does it mean? She asked. It means, I said slowly. They want to look at everything again. Her eyes widened slightly. Really? Yes. She didn't speak for several seconds. Then she whispered, I didn't sound as scared as I felt. That simple statement carried more strength than any applause. Later that evening, after dinner, another email arrived. Official. Formal. Clear. Subject line. Formal invitation, final review session. I opened it slowly. Date listed. 2 days from now. My chest tightened as realization settled in. This wasn't just attention. This was accountability. They weren't ignoring her anymore. They were being forced to see her. And as I read the invitation one more time, the weight of what lay ahead pressed firmly against my chest. Because the next meeting was going to decide whether justice truly existed in this family. The morning of the final review arrived quieter than I expected. Sunlight slipped gently through the curtains, softer than the gray mornings that had filled the past few days. The house felt different, not heavy with fear, but steady with anticipation. I stood in the kitchen, watching Emily move slowly down the hallway toward the bathroom. She carried herself differently now, still quiet, still thoughtful, but not shrinking into the walls the way she once had. She had chosen her outfit carefully that morning. A simple blouse, clean and neat, paired with dark pants she had ironed herself the night before. She paused in front of the hallway mirror, smoothing the edges of her sleeves. Not out of vanity, but preparation. She looked at her reflection for a long moment. Then she nodded once to herself. Not to me, to herself. That was the first sign of how much had changed. My phone buzzed softly on the counter. Reminder, final review meeting. 10:00 a.m. The words felt heavy, but not frightening anymore. Important. Necessary. Emily entered the kitchen, holding a thin folder against her chest. Inside were copies of her speech, notes she had written in her careful handwriting, and a list of thoughts she had practiced reading aloud over the last 2 nights. Ready? I asked gently. She nodded. I think so. Not confident, not fearless, but ready. The drive to the committee building felt shorter than usual. The sky had cleared overnight, sunlight reflecting off the glass windows of downtown Spokane as we pulled into the parking lot. The building itself looked official, tall glass doors, clean steps, polished metal railings. Everything about it felt formal, controlled, serious. Emily stepped out of the car beside me, gripping her folder tightly. I'm nervous, she whispered. So am I admitted. That honesty seemed to comfort her more than reassurance ever could. Inside the waiting room, the air felt thick with tension. And then I saw them. Mother, Megan, already seated across the room. My mother sat stiffly in her chair, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her posture wasn't proud anymore, it was rigid, uncertain. Megan sat beside her, eyes fixed on the floor. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them spoke. Just silence. Emily slowed beside me, but she didn't hide behind my shoulder. She stayed at my side. Not behind. That small difference spoke louder than any words. We sat across from them, the distance between our chairs feeling larger than the space itself. No greeting. No apology. Just tension. After a few minutes, a door opened. A woman stepped into the waiting room. Emily Bennett, she called. Emily stood immediately. Her legs didn't tremble the way they had days earlier. She walked forward with measured steps, her shoulders steady. Inside the review room, a long table stretched across the center. Several committee members sat behind it. Papers arranged neatly before them. Professional. Controlled. Fair. The chairperson spoke first. We appreciate you coming today, she said calmly. We would like to review Emily's eligibility in light of recent developments. Her voice carried no judgment, no criticism, only structure. Then she turned toward Emily. If you would like to speak again, you may. Not required. Offered. A choice. Emily hesitated only briefly before stepping forward. She placed her folder on the table, opening it carefully. When she spoke, her voice came out clear. Not loud. Not forced. Honest. I used to think being quiet meant I didn't belong, she said softly. But I learned that being quiet doesn't mean being invisible. Every word landed gently but firmly. No accusation. No anger. Just truth. She spoke about what it felt like to sit at tables where no one listened. To watch conversations happen without being invited into them. To feel smaller than the space around her. And then she spoke about finding her voice. About standing on that stage. About realizing she didn't need to be loud to be heard. I glanced across the room. My mother sat motionless, tears gathering in her eyes. Megan stared straight ahead, her face pale, her hands tightly clasped together. Neither of them interrupted. Neither of them defended themselves. When Emily finished, silence filled the room. Not uncomfortable silence. Respectful silence. The chairperson nodded slowly. Thank you, she said. Several committee members exchanged quiet looks before returning their attention to the documents before them. Minutes passed. Slow. Heavy. Emily stood beside me again, her hands folded calmly in front of her. Then the chairperson spoke. After reviewing the recent information and Emily's performance, we have reached a decision. My breath caught. Emily Bennett will receive special recognition for her demonstrated courage, communication ability, and community impact. The words settled slowly into the room. Emily blinked. Once, twice, as if she needed time to understand what she had just heard. You earned this, the chairperson added gently. Earned. Not gifted. Not handed. Earned. Emily turned toward me, her eyes wide with disbelief. They chose me, she whispered. Yes, I said softly. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, as if something heavy had lifted. Across the room, my mother remained silent. Her lips trembled, but no words came out. After the meeting ended, we stepped into the hallway. Mother approached slowly, not with authority, not with certainty, but hesitation. I didn't realize, she said quietly. Her voice sounded older than I remembered. Softer. I didn't understand what we were doing to her. The apology felt incomplete, but it existed. For the first time, Megan remained behind her, silent, her confidence gone. No defense, no explanation, just stillness. Outside the building, fresh air filled my lungs. Emily stood beside me, holding her folder tightly against her chest. Are things going to be different now? She asked. I looked down at her. Yes, I said carefully. But not because they changed. Because we did. Mother stepped forward again. Can we fix this? She asked. I paused before answering. Not out of anger. Out of clarity. Respect comes first, I said calmly. Trust comes later. She nodded slowly. Not arguing. Not protesting. Just accepting. Days later, the house felt peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Emily sat at her desk near the window, sunlight falling across her notebook as she wrote. Not hiding. Not shrinking. Writing with quiet confidence. Every now and then, she read a sentence aloud to me without being asked. Without fear. Without hesitation. That alone told me everything had changed. One afternoon, I found the old birthday card, the one she had thrown away, resting neatly on her desk. Flattened. Smoothed. Saved. Not discarded anymore. That night, as I sat beside her while she wrote, my thoughts drifted back to that closed door. The porch. The silence. The humiliation. At the time, I thought that door marked the end of something. But now, I understood the truth. That door didn't close our story. It redirected it. Sometimes rejection isn't the end. Sometimes it's the moment that forces you to rise. Emily looked up from her notebook and smiled softly. Not a forced smile. Not a careful one. A real one. And in that moment, I realized something I wished I had understood years earlier. Protecting your child isn't about fighting loudly. It's about standing firmly. Even when the world tells you to step aside. Even when your own family doubts you. If you've ever stood up for your child or for someone who felt invisible, then you know how heavy that responsibility can feel. And if this story reminded you of your own struggles or your own victories, I hope you'll share them. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to protect someone you love from being overlooked or dismissed. Your story might help someone else feel stronger, braver, and less alone. And if you believe every quiet voice deserves to be heard, stay here with us. There are many more stories ahead, stories about courage, family, justice, and finding strength when everything feels stacked against you. Emily laughed softly behind me, reading another line she had just written. Sunlight filled the room. Peace settled into the air. And this time, no one could ever make her feel invisible again.